there is a discussion about, the culture of the internet as if it touches nothing else, right? As if it is its own site and locality, and as if it can still be decontextualized from the rest of the world. And we know for a fact every day, based on all the things that are happening in the world, that that's just not real.
All right, I'm here today with Legacy Russell. Legacy, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
I'd love to start at the start and ask if you could share a little bit about who you are and your background.
Well, I'm Legacy Russell. I'm the executive director and chief curator of The Kitchen, which is an experimental avant-garde art space and institution that is based in New York City. It's been running since the 1970s. I'm a curator and a writer, and the author of Glitch Feminism, and now as well the author of Black Meme. My work largely revolves around intersections between race, class, and gender, and how we mediate ourselves through and beyond our screens in intersection with digital broadcast and time-based media.
Very cool. And we are here today specifically talking about Black Meme.
Yeah.
This is a really incredible book. And I'd love to first start with asking you if you could, define what you mean by Black Meme and give a little bit of the context for the research in developing this concept.
Yeah, I have been doing the research for some years now. As I'm sure with many folks who are of the internet in terms of digitality, that you keep many browser tabs open, Dropbox archives, and then some. And so this has been something that's kind of been a cumulative project, pulling on lots of different lines of reading and research and things that I'm seeing deep in the internet and beyond. And in 2020, I was invited to give a talk around these topics. And it was kind of at the start of 2020 as the pandemic was coming into fuller being. And so this was on Zoom. And, I think it was a period of time where I was thinking deeply about many of the questions around what it means to have images of Blackness sustained and transmitted and exchanged, and as well what economies, of course, those moments of transmission and also virality pose and as well have kind of reshaped entirely. And so for me, the frame of Black Meme is really to look at, from a broader arc, looking at 1900 to present day, how we define the movement of Blackness through mediated material. And that, of course, is, TV, and that's thinking about, of course, video, and that as well as thinking about, as well as we see different platforms online as we now know it, alongside of movies and kind of the rise of media across different chapters and generations of our ways of looking and seeing. So the work, I think, has come, from that 2020 period into, its next chapter now, rising into, really a study of how Blackness has moved through time and space, has been a blueprint and an archetype for so many other ways of production and kind of cultural and visual vernacular, and as well has established how we engage with technology in many profound and meaningful intersections.
This question with technology and history, I think, is really relevant as a clarification for a lot of folks. Like, I think a lot of folks would come into this book when they see the word meme, they think you're talking about a digital convention. And obviously this book is charting us through the 20th century to the present.
Right.
What were you going to say?
I said, yeah, absolutely.
And you chart the history even further back. So I'd love if you could speak a little bit to what you see that history being and why it's important to understand the meme as not just a digital construction, but something that has a much longer history.
Yeah, so, I agree with you that the title itself invokes, I think, a lot of very contemporary references of, vast and accelerated digital culture as we know it now. When you go online and you Google Black Meme, there are a lot of things that come up. Now, of course, this book is a part of that. the ways in which the title itself is intended to really be a provocation to encourage people to think differently and also to challenge and maybe rattle at some of the core expectations of what is intended to be visible and surfaced and extracted from and transmitted when we think about this idea of the Black meme as a kind of frame and a prompt is really critical. I also, aware, right, that the various examples across 1900 to present day as the book follows with kind of this different sequence of chapters explores examples such as D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation and sets it into contrast with Lime Kiln Field Day, which is a film that now has continued to grow in recognition as being one of the first films on record with an all-Black cast. Thinking about as well the ways that artists such as Garrett Bradley have taken up the task of excavating and bringing into new algorithmic practice the use of Black media and material like Lime Kiln Field Day, which currently sits in the collection at MoMA and has been part of ongoing projects in relation to study around early Black cinema. And then, of course, thinking about the various parts of history as it moves through space and time. And, the first viral video, which, has been widely known as the film that was made by George Holliday of Rodney King being assaulted and harmed at the hands of the LAPD. Thinking about the ways in which, of course, the documentation and broadcast of Anita Hill or Magic Johnson changed and transformed our ways of looking and also really established forward how we think about cultural icons, witness, and testimony in this moment now. And then, as we kind of move through space and time, thinking about moments that, of course, we continue to see in this period now, right, of the very many extractions of Black images, both of Black social death and of Black life, and the ways that Blackness has been manifested and transformed over time through digital space as a model of material, right, and cultural production that continues to be economized. So these are just a few examples of how the book kind of pulls out this idea of the Black meme and really sets it against and in contrast with meme culture, right? To help us think differently about what that means and as well, right, what it means to even consider material that travels over time, Black data as being a core component of that, Black people as being the transmitters and carriers of Black data, originating back to, moments of diaspora as people moved by choice or by force through space and time, that these two are kind of part of the questions that the book poses and explores further. And within the book, too, there is this intermission, if you will, right, of also color plate images. And these are contemporary artists, Glenn Ligon and Kahlil Robert Irving and Rhea Dillon, Amy Sherrill, many artists who have thought deeply about, what does it mean to represent Black people and Black culture, and to think differently, too, about the ways in which that needs to be preserved, tenderly cared for, and transmitted and maintained, even in the face of, and also responsive to, a culture that is both accelerated and increasingly digitized.
Yeah, you have this way of describing the historical act you're attempting with the book, which is that you're not trying to create this canonical, you must understand the history this way, but you're trying to create space for pause. And you sort of touched on that there. Could you walk us through a little bit the thinking around that giving of pause and why that is critical, and then also thinking about the sort of creative and scholarly process of surfacing those moments, because inevitably there's, more instances, I'm sure, that came up in your research that rightfully could have also been included.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge, but also opportunity within the book itself, right, is that Blackness and Black culture is everywhere, and it touches everything. And so, when we think about how do we create a text that can be used as a resource to help us strategize through internet culture, and also as well expand the frame around what that should look like, and who should be included within that as a study of new media, really, as it has continued to transform and expand over time. That the work is very much so about trying to both bring us into awareness about moments across a Black history that have been critical with doing this work and advancing different ideas of how we engage with technology. An example of that, of course, is thinking about Michael Jackson's Thriller. This was a phenomena that really changed so many ways in which people thought about media, bringing the VHS tape itself to new heights in terms of folks, buying the VHS tape, being able to consume that and have it as well exist both inside of their domestic spaces and commercial spaces. So, these are moments in Black history, and also, in the kind of broader broadcast of Black culture, that have changed how we engage with technologies, and also set forward the very possibility of us being able to, hold our smartphone in our hand and be able to exchange, things like music videos and other clips in real time. So the various blueprints, obviously, in terms of technology changing over time, is an important part of this. And I also, feel very committed to this way of breaking apart, again, some of these kind of core assumptions around, the speed, as you said, what does it mean to kind of slow down, and to have a physical text that asks us to think about, an accelerated medium, and then within that, right, to kind of reset how we view and exchange material, and as well how we are accountable to those actions.
Mm. I want to use this moment to you touched on Lime Kiln Field Day a little bit, but I want to zoom in on that because you open the book so powerfully. Let's start with a kiss, and I think there's just so much that can help orient readers and audiences with that story. So if you could share a little bit more about that history, and also how it charts through, up into the 21st century and through its its reappropriation at MoMA and everything that came with that history, as well as that counterfactual path of Birth of a Nation, and how visual culture, that kind of trope and trap aspect of the Black meme you described, that parallel was just so powerful. So I wanted to invite you to share that.
Yeah, well, I feel lucky to have spent time working with Garrett Bradley, who is a phenomenal artist and filmmaker, on her solo show that occurred in collaboration with Studio Museum and MoMA some years back. And, I think it was through that work that I was able to spend more time with Lime Kiln Field Day, and also the film that Garrett created as an extension to that, which is called America. And one of Garrett's provocations within that is to, create maybe new interventions in the algorithm of America. So hopefully, in the work as it continues to unfold, as artists take up the task of thinking through the ways that one can create these interventions, right, that maybe it changes the texture of our visual culture and how we perceive it as we are moving through and beyond our screens. But the work of Lime Kiln Field Day is really significant because for those who have spent time inside of media studies and studies of as well of cinema, oftentimes on many syllabi, we spend time learning about D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which is one of the most virulently racist and problematic texts, I will call it, of American media. And, thinking about what it espouses, it's many of the kind of current tropes and traps that are deeply racialized arc back to this moment of production where this came into the world and was really, a tool of propaganda, quite literally used as kind of part of the training practices of the KKK at one point in American history, right? So Birth of a Nation was also one of the first films that was screened at the White House, right? So it speaks about the cultural consciousness in terms of thinking about broadcast and how material was transmitted. But the great irony of this is that Birth of a Nation, while it continues to appear on many syllabi across the United States and around the world, and is often referenced as an example of how different types of editing and editing techniques are applied, and in many ways, right, given its juxtaposition as a silent film between visuals and text, right, does approximate and really echo much of what we see as the GIF in this moment now. That, it is of itself with such a popularity and a viral presence in our culture of study and as well in many academic institutions, while Lime Kiln Field Day, that came out of the same studio around the same period of time, and as I mentioned prior, was one of the first documented on record all Black casts of films, right? And also as well has a unique and complicated moment to this point of the kiss of seeing Burt Williams and Odessa Warren Gray in a kiss on screen, which is something that was not of the convention at the time, right? And as well continues to be a really important historic moment in terms of Black intimacies. So with this, right, we have these two different films, and we have to ask questions around, if we think about this through the lens of Black meme and viral culture, why is it that D.W. Griffith's film has become such a sensation in terms of how it has been accelerated and visualized and made visible and hyper visible within our culture and study, while at the same time, this other film essentially was lost and forgotten for many, many years until it was resurrected, both at MoMA and then, of course, I think brought to a new platform and possibility entirely by Garrett's phenomenal work. So, with this, I appreciate that, we begin with the kiss because we're thinking very much so about what is seen and not seen, and as well, encouraging people to recognize that much of what we experience as visual culture happening to us actually is a constructed process, right? That we are, inside of sight lines that have been chosen for us, and that determines as well who is remembered and who is not, right? And what is kind of lost and forgotten and what is, made visible and carried forward. And so with this too becomes really the responsibility of this text to take up the task of bringing in different lines of communication and calling into question, why is it that these are things that either we have seen or not seen that have then echoes or blueprints within the work of, our everyday and thinking about a kind of broader model of both art, visual culture, and media broadcast. And what are the ways, too, that we can hold ourselves accountable to have aspects of that pacing be reset when we think about the circulation of these images and materials over time?
There's so many questions that brings up. I guess before it kind of tessellates, are there any other examples of these critical turning points that you outline in the different chapters? Maybe another one or another two that depicts. Yeah.
I mean, I think that we, inside of the kind of frame of media studies, right? We think about obviously cinema and film as being part of that, but also it is discussed in the book the history and tradition of lynching postcards, and that this, of course, is in and of itself a different model of broadcast and also a viral material. That the very idea that there would be a document of the murder of a Black person that would then be sent in the mail physically, right, from person to person and exchanged, and then as well kept as memento, used both, for entertainment, for nostalgia, and as well for memorabilia, right, collected in that way, is something that's really important to also talk about in terms of this relationship of what it means to transmit material through space and time, and also as well representations of Black personhood, right? And in this case, right, what it means to be stripped of that humanity and to be existing within a form that at the time, right, was moving at a very particular speed from place to place inside of often domestic spaces, and as paired with images and text, right? So again, these are these moments that, as you said, are kind of turning points, right, for us to think differently about away from our screens, right, what predated and was informed by lens-based practices, in this case photography, as a model of oppression and as well a strategy, right, that of course enacts a model of supremacy out in the world. So with this too, I think it feels really important to be able to reckon with that, and also at the same time, moving through these different points in history, think about moments such as this is of course many, many years later, but the rise of the popularity of a film like Paris is Burning. Much of the language and vernacular, of course, that we often see that is traveling virally through the internet, which is a kind of queer and Black and Latinx vernacular, often is drawing on materials that were brought into public view and made hypervisible in that moment in time and thereafter, right? And how, of course, that continues to unfold. So again, this idea of kind of not being native to a site, right? Being a spectator and, as well, an extractor of certain types of material, and thinking about, what it means to be responsible for narrating or carrying forward certain stories that perhaps don't belong to you, and have that, of course, occur through the form, right? Again, of a kind of time-based media, in this case of film, that now has gone on to be fractured and distributed in many different places across the internet, and informing our culture as we now know it today in terms of kind of a pop culture lens. So there, I think, are different parts of what the text does that are really looking at this question, as I mentioned before, of authorship, and, kind of recognizing that within this, there are many blueprints for how, of course, we shape our culture now, and as well, right, the ways in which our language, as well as our gesture, right, as Black people, continues to be something that is borrowed from and referenced and cited. And deeply economized, but not always, of course, with the profitability of that, or the benefit to the people who have originated these forms.
Yeah, that question of that paradox of authorship versus remuneration is one of a few paradoxes that Black meme seems to house. This question between compensation and consumption, visibility or legibility, and recognition. How are you thinking about Black meme as embodying that paradox? And not to ask you to be too prescriptive, but thinking about what folks on who are participating in digital culture and are calling it Gen Z slang, or sharing reaction gifs of Black actors, things that in many cases have become so normalized that this is probably their first experience realizing that there's a problematic history to this. Do you have any things that you would point them to, or ways of thinking, or new ways of participating that are addressing the harms in those histories and through those paradoxes?
Yeah, I think we often set apart some of the ongoing exchange and discourse around digital material, cultural production online, digital content. We set it apart from discussions of ownership and property. And so, I think that for me, part of the exercise of this book as well is to complicate that a bit more, and to ask why it is that we would assume that certain things, are intended for free use, or perhaps open source contribution or exchange, or manipulation, right? As we kind of change and transform materials into other materials, as images, of course, are folded into other images, and as, of course, histories are carried with those images as they accelerate through time and space. And then, of course, the discussion around, ownership and property, which, of course, in many ways, right, is predicated within an American context and also a Western context, in a sort of model that has been established, of course, by the state and also by colonial practices, right? So the idea of property in and of itself is an anti-Black premise. But, I think that when we reflect on what that means, the reason why, of course, I would propose that it is an anti-Black premise is because of the fact that Black people, of course, were perceived as property and treated as property, not as human beings, for many, many years. And so for this, right, we have it in entire legal system that, of course, is predicated on better understanding, right, property through this lens that has been established and transformed and changed over time with Black people as part of that story, in terms of being fungible assets that can be exchanged, right? And as part of a broader economy that is a core driver of our foundation of capitalism. So, with this, I think it is unique and important to try to bring together these different points, right? Why is it that we set apart this idea of other people's images as we find them online and how we circulate them as being something that, should not engage questions of consent and ownership and whose property, right? How can that be something, a kind of question both of belonging and of ownership that can be intersectional? And then as well, right, the ways in which we can maybe consider with the very many discussions in art history, a discourse around a repatriation or a provenance as also being maybe a necessary point of conversation within the movement of images, even if they are freely accessed online, but perhaps are not ones that belong to us, right, or that have originated from us. And this is something I think that, is both about the image, it's about the gesture, right? What does that mean in terms of Black movement and choreography? It's about sound, right? What does it mean, of course, to have aspects of Black sonic practices travel and transform? And of course, the rise of AI and how that continues to be a core component of our popular culture and imagination as we're seeing it kind of take hold in creating copies of copies, right? But also at the same time echoing and resurrecting different models of Black culture and Black personhood. All of this, of course, needs to kind of live in a loop, right? Rather than kind of be set apart. And so the goal here is, of course, to have these things be made more complicated, right? And more nuanced, because I believe deeply that these are parts of our ongoing culture that do have sightlines to one another. And then also at the same time, right, to be asking about what are the ways in which we've learned from, for example, ongoing discourse around Black culture, extraction, the economies there, and thinking about, for example, in relationship to Black music, royalties, right? And the way that royalties maybe have been withheld or used as a source of manipulation or dispossession. And here in this moment now, right, thinking about this kind of question of viral Black culture and where royalties, that framework, its intersection with property, do or do not have a frame that can allow for us to kind of be able to fully grasp what is necessary in this next chapter to think differently and critically about forms of compensation for Black makers and those who are producing online. Interestingly, I know that there have been some attempts and examples of folks in the NFT craze, right, where people have attempted to create NFTs out of their memes, right, as a means of shaping economy around their image and of course, their cultural contributions, whether they have chosen to do that or it's been something that has been almost an act of refusal to push back against something that has happened to them because images of them have traveled without their consent. But I still think that that is a very thin and flat concept, right? It's something that has not really been fully formed or realized as a strategy to do this work, to kind of connect these different pieces of the vast number of materials that are traveling at an accelerated pace, and still the very thin and often poorly realized and protected formats that exist to allow for people to be able to, think differently about not only establishing what those boundaries are, but also what authorship looks like and their relationship to owning or reclaiming their own image. So these are kind of parts of what I would hope for in terms of folks who are coming newly into this concept. And like I said, right, it's about allowing this conversation to be more nuanced and necessarily complicated, because of course we will always have, our gifts and our emojis and items that we exchange and recreation, right? But even so, being able to understand the relationship between on and offline and the materials that we, of course, are assuming that have always existed in still a very young history of the internet, as if they have not been informed by what comes before, is part of this dilemma. And that is what Black Meme sets out to address.
You also reference, ideas that invoke other folks' research that, sorry, I'm gonna start that again. You also invoke ideas like mimetic emancipation, data healing, and copy norms, all of which seem to have different strategic potency around both healing and remuneration. So yeah, I'd love to invite you to speak to some of those ideas and some of the other strategies, the sort of burgeoning strategies you're seeing that are maybe not, structural changes like legal changes, but are happening possibly at the level of culture or in sub-communities.
Well, the study of copy norms does intersect with legal change, right? And so that actually is its own sort of vast and dense wormhole that we could spend many hours talking about. But, I appreciate you bringing it up because the very framework of copy norms is also thinking about what it means to copyright material and if that's even possible. And of course, in my case, inside of a space as a curator and a writer where I'm often thinking about performance, right? It is constantly a slippery question to say, is it even possible to copyright a gesture, right? But of course, when we are online and we are seeing often that many folks who are Black creators are having to ask questions about this idea of authorship in relationship to the even possible protections of copyright, that this in of itself is, I think, an increasingly important issue. When we talk about data healing, of course, this was a term that has been theorized on in a variety of different ways, but Nima Gither and as well Olivia Michaela Ross, both in across their practices, have thought deeply about what it means to exist inside of frames of data healing. And part of the inquiry around this, and what I think is really important, is to really reflect, as I mentioned before, about the movement of Black people by force and as well, by choice, depending on moments of history, from place to place over time, and as well the ways in which, in that movement, we are both displaced and as well having to make certain strategic decisions about how our knowledge is carried with us, right? And that is both, a somatic practice, how, of course, knowledge is passed on, body to body and generation to generation. And then, of course, the very many channels of cultural production that shape our relationship to objecthood, right? What is produced out of those somatic transmissions, and how do those things take on a material form? And so when we think about data healing, I think it's about acknowledging that there are many different channels of digitality, right? And many different communities that exist online. And while I think still, even now, I find it to be relatively tiresome that we're constantly playing back this idea that everything online exists through a lens of trauma, right? When we have seen evidence otherwise, which is that we are able to organize online, that people who do not feel protected in physical space have been able to do critical work of engaging and shaping community through their screens, right, and creating space for that to occur. We've been able to build and produce outside of academic systems that do not love us by producing scholarship and exchanging ideas as Black people online and in digital space, right? So there's a lot of, I think, really amazing things that continue to rise inside of a culture of the internet, but at the same time, right, to think about data healing, it's an opportunity as well to reckon with this idea that we have parts of ourselves played back to ourselves on a regular basis, and that aspects of that can create kind of a digital dysphoria in relationship to seeing how vast that production is, while at the same time, right, not necessarily having that reflected in how we are represented in the world or equitable structures of care and consideration. So I do think that the relationship between these different points is one that's really important and exciting. And as you said, right, the structural work alongside of that is really critical. But, the healing process through that and, being able to kind of move between these different chapters of how, of course, Blackness can be extracted from, but also as well, how can we think differently about what it means to refuse or glitch through models of hypervisibility to have some sense of autonomy and agency and empowerment be possible, is also to a kind of question that I'm keen to put forward.
You brought up a glitch, so I have to obviously segue us to talking a little bit about glitch feminism and also what you see the threads, because these two books seem to emerge from a similar set of concerns and questions. So I want to open to you to describe that project and also how you see them being related.
Yeah, I mean, I think there may be two sides of a coin in many ways, right? I feel like glitch feminism, my hope is that in many ways it's an optimistic text, while it points out the flaws and failures of digital space and the ways in which, of course, historically oppressed people have been kept often at the margins, right, of different models of cultural production. We also see at the center of glitch feminism a call to action in many artists who are working through their Blackness, their queerness, their intersectionality, doing strategic creative work to create new space and applying technologies to make that possible, right? So for me, the optimism of the text is about asking folks to think about, what does that look like to kind of exist in this space where you are both hyper visible but not always represented? How can that, of course, be turned on its ear? And then also, what are the creative strategies to move through that with the glitch as a kind of conceptual framework? With Black Meme, I think, my hope is that it's an opportunity to expand a viewfinder, if you will. I think that, I've spent so many years inside of the study of these different types of work and practice. And as someone who is an art historian, but also, a student and lover of visual culture and popular culture, I think it has been amazing to me the amount of times where even still now, there is a discussion about, the culture of the internet as if it touches nothing else, right? As if it is its own site and locality, and as if it can still be decontextualized from the rest of the world. And we know for a fact every day, based on all the things that are happening in the world, that that's just not real. So, I think that this speaks to the fact that many sort of academic institutions and as well, spaces of learning still are trying to grapple with how to teach and talk about these topics without having it exist in a place of such immense density that there maybe is no end in sight, right? I understand that things have to kind of be broken into sound bites to exist in even the very format of being able to be taught, for example, in a classroom or to exist on a panel. But, I still think that, with this, it's really important to kind of set the context of the digital into the world. And for us to be able to think about, with the very many moments where we are looking at contemporary examples as in things that are happening to us here in this moment now and the ways that it intersects with the digital, for us as well to be reminded that aspects of these things are predicated by things that we may now define as offline, right, because they're existing in a different form, but actually, of course, have been profound in impacting digitality and how we are transmitting images and as well creative practices, across different modes of representation. So the glitch and Black Meme, I think, are inherently interlinked in that way, I would just say. And my hope is that, perhaps that they can be read together and, as well that the topics within them can be used to kind of challenge differently, maybe what the necessary work needs to be of support to artists and also creative people who are existing in the world and thinking about the need to protect and care for and steward the Black image and Black cultural production overall.
Mm. That necessarily brings us to, you brought up AI earlier, and I feel like there's so many things we could talk about, but maybe the entry point is what you just described, which is like questions of archives and how do we keep archives from falling into the same historical, oppressive, harmful patterns that, the past instances you document in the book. I realize that question sort of like trailed, funnily, but I want to open on this idea of archives as a way into talking about this kind of new wave of algorithmic tools.
I think it's really interesting because obviously when you say archive, I'm thinking about, which archive and whose and, how do we define that, right? I'm thinking about the body as an archive and that, within Black Meme, part of what, the book talks about is the material, right? The data that is carried by Black people from place to place over time, but also, of course, thinking about the architecture of the archive, right? Both digital and otherwise, and how, of course, that exists, both with its many colonial problems and then also its decolonial possibilities. I also am thinking very much so about questions of labor. And you mentioned before Harmony Holliday's term mimetic emancipation. She's written some beautiful essaying around this idea, right, about what it means to kind of emancipate this kind of transmitted Blackness and have it maybe take on different modes of liberation. And for me, I also, I think that we have to ask that question too when we are seeing so many examples, right, of the ways in which, is it the hologram of a pop star who is performing even though they are no longer alive? And that allows for our models of capitalism to continue in the exact ways that they always have, with no clarity around the necessity of that labor being something that has to continue with no end, and or thinking about what it means really to create and produce ideas of bodies, right, that are intended to stand as symbol and perform outward indefinitely into eternity, without really questioning for who and for what and for to what end. I am often greatly concerned by this idea of the archive when it is perhaps manipulated or weaponized to be able to justify the resurrection of Black labor in a way that still does not fully address the very many historicized problems of having Black entertainment be something that is done machinically and mechanically, and again, without a clear economy of compensation around it. And then at the same time, right, I also appreciate that there is a great possibility of thinking about, what the digital can do. I often say that the internet is the largest cultural institution in the world. It is something that I think, many folks, who are coming from a wide variety of practices have yet maybe to settle on as such, right? But I, appreciate the visitorship of being able to even exist in a digital space with the many intersections is something that rivals every cultural institution in the world. And so for those who are slow moving in this process to think about that and its relationship to the question of the archive and who it's for, and as well what is made visible, and as well what the work is that we can do to make sure that we are resurrecting materials so that they can live on in new forms, as we, of course, have discussed Garrett Bradley doing with Lime Kiln Field Day, that, this is a moment where aspects of those things also too need to be folded into this conversation, and to be able to think broadly about the very many digital archives that have been produced, that will continue to be produced, and as well what it means to take up the task of protecting and preserving and resurrecting materials with an empowered possibility as we move into this next chapter of a world that really continues to break down and break apart, with our commitment still to share in a very existence of a future in the first place.
I really appreciate that. So thinking about what this buzzy subject of generative AI means and how it interacts with your previous point, and I just want to kind of open up to what are some other maybe concerns that you are having related to generative AI and the Black meme, but also are there any strategies for liberation that you're identifying, whether latent or tangibly?
I typically try to avoid fear mongering around these topics, if only because of the fact that I do believe that we're still such in an early stage of discovering how aspects of these technologies can be applied, and the broader understanding of where that intersects with our visual culture and economies, I think, is something that folks are still coming to terms with and wrapping their head around, right? So oftentimes we hear AI narrated at us about, how it is displacing the human being, right? right? And or undermining aspects of cultural creative capital, right? But I also recognize, right, that there are many incredible things that are kind of coming into being in terms of exploring possibilities of production, of exchange, of learning, right? Even just, in a very 1.0 sense, it's amazing that there are folks that are in my community who are, in their 80s and have been able to use Chat GPT as a means to learn about things like glitch feminism, right? Like it's actually, that's quite incredible. And I think that's so important that these things can be possible. But in a broader sense, that, I want to go back to thinking about, what does it mean to allow for certain parts of Black labor to be at rest. And I do think that, while aspects of kind of AI and what it resurrects, and of course the kind of gamified notion that it can imitate or bend our understanding of reality can be something that is both deeply disturbing, but also in many ways part of the uncanny valley continuation of the internet. It's also really important, I think, to recognize that, it has shaped deeply aspects of how we are understanding what is true. And that, is, I think, a really important point for the period that we are in the world now, with the very many atrocities that continue to be ongoing in very many positions across the world, and how, of course, AI is being applied as a strategy, really, to work against a unified vision of what is true. And as well within that, right, fracturing a possibility for folks to be able to understand, right, the impact and implication of ongoing global events. So, these are manipulations that have been part of a broader propaganda over time. In any given moment, whenever there is something that is occurring in the world that is a violence, right, there always is going to be a force and counterforce, a fact and counterfact that are kind of working within that. But I think that the way in which images are traveling, right, the sheer speed of that is something that, and the ease of it is something that is unprecedented. And so when you ask about my concerns, right, this also too is bound up within a conversation tied to the Black meme, which is that, the moment that we are in is not like these other moments across history. While those moments have existed as a blueprint to get to where we are now, one of the core challenges is that the copy of a copy and the many manipulations of the image as we now know it continue to change and change shape at a rapid speed that oftentimes we don't know where the beginning was. And we also, struggle, I think, to even be able to wrap our head around the edges of this level of vastness as it continues to expand outward. So, these are things that I want people to think about. And, I certainly appreciate that there are folks like myself who sometimes lose a little sleep over it, if not a lot of sleep. But, the idea, again, like I said, is not to fearmonger, right? To have people set into a state of terror about it, but rather to understand the implications of it, right? That if our very sense and understanding of what is real is being impacted by aspects of how images are transmitted and the way that they are manipulated as they move from space to space, then we need to have a different level of criticality in how we read images. And that is really what my hope is, and kind of call into presence when we think about this idea of, a next step, a recommendation forward, right? That we have to have a slow read inside of a fast-paced moment.
I couldn't agree with that more. I so appreciate that point. I have 3 recurring questions that I like to close these episodes with. So the first of which is, what is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
The conversation around TikTok. Which sounds funny because I think that many people, right, of course, pay attention to TikTok. But the implications of what is happening right now with TikTok and the way in which it has been wrapped up into this fantasy of protection of people as it continues to be challenged in terms of its regulation is something that is very important to spend time learning more about. So I wish very much so for people across generations to take that seriously. I've been very surprised in moments where people have kind of like clicked to the next channel because, the assumption that there will always be some platform where people can do some version of what they do on TikTok is not the focal point. I think the focal point is that we are in a unique moment where in this turn in history, there are more elections and changeovers politically that are happening around the world than in many years prior, right? And so having all of those rotations happen at the same time, thinking about its relationship to digital space and asking about what restrictions or liberations are possible and or being undermined within the work of moving between these platforms and having, of course, the state in its regulation of them is a really important question to ask now.
Mm. I was actually thinking of Black Meme in relation to some of those conversations bubbling up in the way that you write about Vine and the role that Vine has played. And there seems to be a sort of slanted echo there where it is TikTok seems to be a place for the type of communication that we'll say the white hegemony is less enthusiastic about.
Yes, I would say absolutely. And I also think that people didn't take it seriously as it began because of what they assumed it was for, right? Which was this idea of the influencer, right? To kind of like make it quippy. But political influence is profound. And what is, I think, really important and exciting about, these very flawed, very problematic platforms that are deeply mired in systems of hegemony and also, strategies of kind of monopoly in their business practice still, is that people have continued to be resilient in how they are using them to communicate with one another and to do very necessary and strategic work of rebellion and refusal through these channels. So, I think many folks of maybe a particular generation or who are existing kind of in these state models had their comeuppance when they realized that these were the same platforms that people could organize powerfully and progressively through. And I wish often that we were taking more time to have aspects of those conversations to think differently about what we need to be advocating for, because these are the very serious signals and signifiers of a censorship that veers us far away from what we assume to be a democracy. And so that is something that I wish people spent more time talking about.
Flipping the script a little bit, what is one resource you use to make better sense of reality?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I don't know if it's like literally, is there a certain tool or if there is maybe a mechanism. And I've realized that, and so I'm going to answer this question maybe in relationship to mechanisms that I have been applying in just my day to day. And one of those things is responding to less and thinking more. And so that takes shape in a variety of different ways, but it's about sitting and listening, and it is about taking time to reflect and also asking about in what ways is my voice and vision needed? Who am I waking up in the morning to be of service to? And if there is some small way of making a change in a gear, right? Like how can I be part of doing that work and having that be something that has its own resonance, right? In terms of kind of a vibration into the world. And so, yeah, I think that for me has been a really important way of kind of like cross-checking what reality needs to be, and also what is real, because oftentimes I think we're seeing a lot, and of course I'm speaking from a position of being in the art world. In the art world, often we are still mired in the very many complications of the labor of cultural workers, what it means to have that set into the systems and economies of art history. What does it look like to really think about recognition, right, in terms of exhibition making? and how, of course, these things can change or shape how we approach our presence through and beyond the academy, right, or the institution. And I think every day is an opportunity to ask, is this real, right? And so, is this real? Is it an emergency? Whose emergency is it? And who can I be of service to and of presence in terms of making sure that we are aligning in realities, and that I am affirming the very many truths that need to remain consistent in order for us to change not only the art world, right, but also to be change makers and catalysts of transformation out in the world.
Mm. And finally, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Well, this is gonna be a little bit of like a tear, but I'm gonna say when I gave birth to my child, who is 7 months old now. And I was saying to you before we got started, I'm like, I gotta get my face on because I'm, here with the baby. But I say this because I think it's actually really important. And I'm making an effort to say it because I think before becoming a parent, I was a carer of a parent, of my parent, right? And I think the very profound growth that becomes possible when you are thinking about different models of care as they are enacted intergenerationally changes entirely how one reads the world. And it hits everyone differently, right? It changes everyone differently. There are all sorts of carers, of course, that have made it possible for each of us to even be here and right now. But one of the things I think that is so profound about, now having this little person that I have to take care of is having to recognize at the same time the amount of things that had to go right for this to even become possible, right? And then with the great level of gratitude, right? And also with grief too, for the very many number of people who did not make it to this moment now, right? That we are inside of that every single day. And it makes me incredibly grateful to be in exchange with the very many brilliant human beings that I interact with, even fleetingly, right? Whether it's in passing or in my day-to-day where I get to work and collaborate with folks across many different disciplines and perspectives. So for me, that's my little tear in my eye, because I could not have fathomed that gear would have changed and shifted as deeply as it has. But it has made me deepen in my sense and understanding of what my commitment is to even think about what it is to be a carer, right? And also, a steward in some ways, right? A steward of stories, of people, of projects, and how, of course, that allows for it to be possible for us to sit here, right now, and say that the very many things that had to line up came back to the very many carers who showed up to do that work over time. And perhaps my way of giving back to that as a possibility that brought me here is to make sure that I hold space to do the same.
Mm. Well, that's the perfect note for us to wrap up this conversation. It's been incredibly informative. Plug, everybody should read this book. It stays with you. It stays with you, not necessarily because it's comforting, but it's necessary. Legacy, are there any new projects or things on the way that people should know about, and where can they find you and your work?
Gosh, I would say come visit us at the Kitchen. It's a really special institution in New York. For those of you who are learning newly about it, you can visit us online. We kind of have an ongoing and live broadcast of the things that are happening across the institution, with very many components of our archive and creative production across the generations of 1971 to present. So intersectional with many of our topics here, and also too an amazing hub of artistic imagination. So you can find me there, and as well the amazing makers and thinkers that are my collaborators, which of course is what makes this work possible.
Amazing. Thank you again so much for being on Urgent Futures.
Thank you for having me.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.